I was standing in the doorway of my own kitchen the night everything finally cracked open, one hand gripping a tray of roasted vegetables, while Rachel's voice sliced clean through the warm hum of Christmas Eve. It wasn't even the words that stunned me at first, it was the tone, that sharp, controlled lawyer's edge she used in court. "Where are you?" "You're being incompetent, Mom. The food isn't ready, and my guests are staring at empty plates." Somewhere inside me, something small and fragile shifted like a hairline fracture that had been waiting for one more ounce of pressure before giving way. I remember the glow of the living room lights, the soft music curling through the air, the murmurs of laughter from people I barely knew, people Rachel had invited to show them a version of her life she needed them to believe. Their conversations dipped when her voice rose, and though they tried to look polite, I felt their eyes sliding toward the kitchen doorway toward me, toward the spectacle of a mother being scolded like hired help. The steam from the tray fogged my glasses, and in the blurred reflection of the oven door, I saw a woman I barely recognized, cheeks flushed, shoulders curled inward, hair slipping loose from its pins, like it too had grown exhausted from holding itself together. I lifted the tray again, pretending my hands weren't trembling, pretending my heart wasn't cracking open in ways I wouldn't fully understand until much later. But that Christmas Eve confrontation, the moment that would eventually become the end of one life and the beginning of another, didn't start that night. It started 3 years earlier on a bitter January evening when the Ohio air felt sharp enough to cut. I opened my front door to find Rachel standing on my porch with snowflakes clinging to her hair and 2 sleepy children leaning against her legs. Dan hovered behind her carrying 2 suitcases and wearing the stiff, embarrassed smile of a man who wanted to disappear. "Mom, can we come in?" she asked, her voice trembling in a way that made my heart twist. Lily stumbled in first, rubbing her eyes, and little Jake climbed straight into my arms with the unfiltered relief of a child who trusts you completely. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I simply stepped aside and let them in. We sat in the living room with their coats still on, and Rachel explained how the housing deal they'd counted on had collapsed, how their rental had fallen through, how their finances were tied up. Just for a few months, she whispered, tears spilling as she leaned into me. "Just until we figure things out." My house had been unbearably silent since Robert passed, and their footsteps, their laughter, their chaos filled something inside me I hadn't known was empty. So I told them the guest rooms were ready. I told them I was glad to have them home. I told myself this was a second chance. For a while, it even felt true. Weekends in the kitchen with Rachel humming while chopping vegetables, Dan fixing the loose hinge on the backyard gate, Lily's drawings taped crookedly along the hallway, Jake barreling into my lap whenever he needed comfort. I let myself believe we were healing old fractures. I let myself believe my daughter missed me, not just the stability I represented. And I let myself believe we were rebuilding something. I didn't realize then how quietly the balance would shift, or how easily love could turn into obligation when no one noticed the line between them had blurred or disappeared. It's strange how change can slip into a house without ever knocking, how it can settle quietly into corners, until one day you wake up and realize it has rearranged everything you thought you understood. At first, the shifts were so small I barely noticed them. Rachel would come home exhausted, drop her purse on the counter, and murmur, "Mom, could you start dinner? I had a brutal day." It didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something I could do to help my child breathe a little easier. But then, it wasn't just dinner. One evening, she asked me to pick up Lily and Jake from school because a meeting had run late. Then Dan started texting during the day, could I wait for a package? Could I let in the plumber? Could I fold a load of laundry so he wouldn't fall behind? I told myself they were overwhelmed. I told myself families helped each other. I told myself I didn't mind. I should have minded. The first moment something inside me hesitated just slightly was over groceries. I casually mentioned I hadn't seen their share of the bill for a while. Rachel slipped her arm around my shoulders and kissed my cheek, her voice sweet as honey, when she said, "Mom, do you know how much we'd spend on childcare if you weren't here? You're saving us." She said it lovingly as though she were complimenting me, and yet something about it didn't sit right. Not quite guilt, not quite resentment, more like a quiet tap at the back of my mind asking if I was still helping or being used. But I pushed that thought away. It's astonishing how quickly you can talk yourself out of discomfort, especially when it's your own child causing it. By the middle of the second year, the shifts no longer needed asking, they had become routine. I woke before dawn to pack lunches and start laundry. I tidied the kitchen, sorted bills, ran errands, and kept track of school schedules. I answered questions from teachers' signed forms and made sure every small piece of their life kept moving. If I ever hesitated, even for a moment, Rachel's expression would sharpen the way it did in court, disappointed, irritated, as if my tiredness was a personal inconvenience. She loved telling me I was being dramatic whenever I expressed needing rest. I started believing her. Then came the rainy Thursday. I had finally scheduled a doctor's appointment for the pain in my knee. Carol had offered to drive me, and I remember feeling almost proud that I was taking care of myself for once. But that morning, Rachel burst into the kitchen in a panic, explaining that a last-minute hearing had been added to her docket, and the babysitter had canceled. "Mom, please, can you stay with the kids? I can't lose this case." Her eyes were frantic, pleading in a way that made my heart fold in on itself. I canceled my appointment without a second thought. Later, when Carol knocked to ask why I hadn't gone, I told her I'd forgotten. She studied me, her eyes soft and terribly knowing, and said quietly, "Be careful, Maggie. You matter too." Her words rattled something loose inside me, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The unraveling continued quietly, steadily, like a slow drip, wearing away the stone of my life. One evening, Rachel informed me she was hosting colleagues for dinner. I assumed we'd cook together like we used to, but when she appeared in the kitchen wearing a crisp blazer, she barely looked at me as she asked, "Mom, is the roast done? They'll be here in 20 minutes. In that moment, I realized she hadn't cooked a thing. Not only was I serving the meal, she hadn't planned to lift a finger. When her colleagues arrived, she introduced me not as her mother, but as Helen. She helps us around the house. I stood there smiling politely while inside something wilted in a way that felt permanent. And yet even then, even with that sting fresh in my chest, I still told myself I was imagining things, until the day the folder fell off Dan's desk. The morning I found the folder should have been unremarkable, the kind of quiet weekday that slips by unnoticed. The house was calm, almost too calm. A thin gray light drifting through the windows as I carried a basket of folded clothes toward the small room Dan used as his office. I'd been in that room 100 times, usually to drop off papers he asked me to sort or to set aside mail he wanted me to organize. But as I set the basket down, my elbow brushed the edge of the cluttered desk, and a thin folder slid off the top of a stack and scattered across the floor, its pages fanning out like a deck of cards. I bent to gather them, murmuring irritably to myself, annoyed at my own clumsiness. But when I reached for the first page, my breath caught. My name, Margaret Hale, was printed across the top in bold clinical lettering. Beneath it, a title that made the back of my neck prickle. Proposed guardianship and long-term care plan. For a moment, I simply stared, unable to process the words. I told myself it had to be some misunderstanding, some form Dan was reviewing for work, something unrelated to me. But the details pulled me in each line, tightening the air around me. It described concerns about my supposed declining cognitive abilities and increasing confusion. It recommended appointing Rachel as my legal guardian, citing her capacity to manage financial and medical decisions. And there, attached to the back of the packet, was a drafted outline proposing the transfer of my home into a living trust controlled by Rachel and Dan for long-term planning and tax efficiency. My hands trembled so violently I had to sit on the edge of the bed. every sentence felt like a strike against my chest, a cold dismantling of my life laid out in impersonal language. I read emails between Rachel and a care facility more than an hour away, discussing availability, memory evaluations, payment plans. I found notes suggesting they should begin documenting signs of disorientation to support a guardianship petition. I thought of the canceled doctor's appointment the way Rachel would tell me I was forgetting things even when I knew I hadn't, the way she introduced me as someone who helps around the house, the exhaustion she mistook or pretended to mistake for something else. A part of me screamed to stop reading, but another part, the part that had grown too tired to ignore the truth, knew I needed to see every word, and I did. When I finished, I forced my shaking fingers to take photos of each page. I placed everything back exactly as I'd found it, smoothing the edges as if the folder might scream if disturbed. Then I walked out of the room, my pulse thundering, my legs unsteady beneath me. That evening, I tried to act as though nothing had changed. Rachel bustled in after work talking about a motion she'd filed and a victory she was sure was coming. Dan asked what was for dinner, dropping a stack of unopened mail beside my plate. The kids ran around me in circles, laughing, unaware that something inside me had split clean open. At one point, Rachel casually mentioned needing to finalize some long-term planning, brushing her hair back as she poured herself wine. She didn't notice the way I froze, how my fingers tightened on the edge of the counter, how the room seemed to tilt around me. She didn't notice anything at all. I waited until the house settled into its nightly rhythm, the kids tucked in the dishes drying on the rack. Then I walked out the front door and went straight to Carol's house. She opened the door and froze when she saw my face. I didn't make it 3 steps inside before my voice broke. I told her everything, the folder, the emails, the trust, the lies. Carol listened, her jaw clenching, her eyes burning with protective fury. When I finished, she said in a low, steady voice, "Maggie, this isn't just disrespect. This is an attempt to take your life from you." Her certainty shattered whatever denial I had left. That night, sitting at Carol's kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea cooling in my hands, I decided something I had never dared to before I would fight back. In the weeks that followed, I moved through my own home, like someone learning the contours of a stranger's house. Everything looked the same, the familiar photographs on the staircase wall, the soft hum of the heater in the evenings, the faint scent of lemon cleaner I'd used for decades, but nothing felt the same. I carried the knowledge of that folder like a stone in my pocket, solid and heavy, shifting with every step. Rachel spoke to me as she always had, briskly, distractedly, often with the assumption I was already doing whatever she needed. Dan continued placing mail by my coffee cup, continued asking if I could run errands or sort their insurance forms. And the children, sweet, oblivious Lily and Jake, continued bringing drawings to my lap and curling against me during cartoons, unaware that their parents were quietly building a future without me in it. Carol urged me gently but steadily to meet with the attorney she trusted, and after several nights of lying awake staring at the ceiling until 3 a.m., I finally agreed. When I stepped into Olivia Grant's office, I felt small, embarrassed, even as though I were overreacting to things that good mothers were supposed to endure. But Olivia greeted me with a calm, professional warmth that softened my nerves. Her office was lined with heavy books and tidy files, and on her desk was a lamp that cast gentle gold light across the room, making the space feel safe in a way I desperately needed. I handed her my phone with the photos of the documents. She read them slowly, each page turning with a soft, deliberate rustle. When she finished, she folded her hands, looked directly at me, and said, "Margaret, you are completely competent. What they are attempting is not planning, it is control." The steadiness in her voice steadied something inside me. She explained my rights, explained how guardianship works, explained that what Rachel and Dan were drafting had no legal ground without evidence. "Your home," she said, tapping her pen lightly on the desk, "is yours, and we will protect it." She helped me update every legal document power of attorney healthcare directives, property protections. She placed safety nets around my life where Rachel had intended locks. When we were done, she instructed me to keep documenting everything and to stay aware because there would come a moment when I needed to speak the truth out loud. I didn't know that moment would arrive sooner than either of us expected. By the time Christmas Eve approached, the house had become a place I moved through quietly, cautiously, like something fragile might crack if I breathed too loudly. Rachel was frantic preparing for her holiday dinner, barking instructions to Dan, ordering last-minute decorations, and using my kitchen as if it had always belonged to her. She instructed me on timing recipes, plating, never once calling it my home, never once asking if I wanted to rest. Carol arrived early to help, though we both knew she came mostly to stand beside me. And later, my brother Tom stepped through the door, his presence a solid comfort, his eyes heavy with the understanding we had shared privately over the phone. The house filled with people, Rachel's colleagues, neighbors. She wanted to impress friends who believed her life was as pristine as the holiday decor suggested. Laughter drifted from the living room, clinking glasses, the smell of rosemary and roasted vegetables. Everything was warm and glowing, the perfect picture Rachel had curated. Then she stepped into the kitchen, arms crossed, jaw tight, and said sharply, "Where are you, Mom? You're being incompetent. The food isn't ready, and my guests are waiting." Her voice cut through the air so cleanly the entire house seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time, instead of shrinking, I felt something in me stand. For a moment, I simply stood there with the tray in my hands, the heat bleeding through the metal and warming my palms as though the vegetables themselves were urging me to stay steady. The kitchen felt impossibly still, the sounds of the party in the next room receding into a dull hum behind the sharp echo of Rachel's accusation. It was astonishing how familiar that tone had become, how reflexively I'd once folded under it. But that night, something different stirred inside me, something quietly fierce, something that had been gathering strength in the shadows while the rest of my life fell under someone else's control. I carried the tray to the dining room, setting each dish down with deliberate care. Carol watched me with steady, encouraging eyes, her lips pressed together in a way that told me she was ready for whatever came next. Tom sat near the end of the table, his posture calm but alert, like a man who knew a storm was brewing, but trusted the person at its center to handle the first strike. The room buzzed with polite conversation until Rachel lifted her glass, preparing to launch into one of her polished holiday toasts. She barely drew breath before I interrupted. "I need to speak." A hush fell. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical, just a sudden collective pause, as though everyone sensed something shifting. I walked to the sideboard, opened the drawer, and pulled out the neatly printed documents I had placed there earlier, keeping them flat and visible as I laid them on the table. The bold title, Proposed Guardianship and Long-Term Care Plan, shone beneath the chandelier's warm light. Rachel's face blanched, her hand tightening around her wine glass until her knuckles went white. Dan looked like someone had yanked the ground out from under him. "These," I said, my voice even, "are the plans my daughter and her husband have been making for me. Plans I had no knowledge of." A ripple of shock went through the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." Rachel shook her head quickly, tears springing to her eyes, her voice cracking as she said, "Mom, you're misunderstanding. This was just planning. We were trying to help." But I didn't raise my voice. I simply held the weight of her words up against the truth I'd carried for weeks. "No," I said quietly for once. "I'm not misunderstanding anything." I explained the guardianship proposal, the draft to transfer my home, the emails with the care facility. I did not embellish or accuse. I told the truth calmly and completely. Rachel stepped closer, her face blotched with panic and remorse, whispering, "You've been overwhelmed. You forget things. I thought you needed help." My heart ached because part of me wished desperately that she believed her own excuses, but I met her gaze and said, "I forget because I am tired. I am overwhelmed because I've been carrying a household that wasn't mine to carry. That doesn't mean I'm incapable. It means I'm human." By then, she was crying openly, and several guests slipped out, murmuring awkward goodbyes. When the room emptied, I told her the rest my legal protections were already in place, and she and Dan had 30 days to move out. If they pursued their plans further, I would take legal action. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary, the first real one I'd ever set. Lily appeared in the hallway, sleepy and confused, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Jake peeked from behind her leg. I knelt down and hugged them both, whispering that everything would be okay. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quiet again. But the quiet no longer felt heavy or lonely. It felt honest. I painted my bedroom a soft, buttery yellow. I planted new flowers with Carol in the spring. I joined a watercolor class and rediscovered the simple pleasure of choosing how I spent my morning. Rachel began visiting with a gentler presence. She asked before assuming. She listened before speaking. We were rebuilding, but this time, the foundation was mine. And sometimes when sunlight warms the kitchen counter and the house feels full of peace, I hear my own voice rising softly from the quiet saying, "I am still here." And being here fully freely finally feels like a victory I once believed was no longer possible. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing for more cinematic storytelling. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.